Hi, here we are. Tragedy. What does that mean? Well, I'm sure you're familiar with the two masks of drama, right? The comedy mask, right? The laughing face, and then the sad mask, tragic face. Goes way back. In fact, Aristotle in his Poetics talked about tragedy. And he defined it as a serious plot ending in catastrophe. Not good. Usually the protagonist, the lead character, call him Oedipus, call him King Lear, has some really bad stuff happen. Tragedies happen to the great, and they fall. After all, if you're talking about somebody who is peasant, you don't have so far to fall anyway. They're already kind of living in the muck as it is, right? So what's interesting, though, Aristotle, he talked about the circumstances of the tragedy arousing fear and pity. Okay, fear, that's easy to understand. Pity, we feel bad for somebody. And that it ultimately ends in a catharsis of these emotions, kind of a letting loose of these things. So what's striking to me is the focus on the audience, right? The tragedy and its effect on the viewer, the watcher, or in our case, the reader, right? It's kind of interesting. And what's noted is that the audience doesn't leave depressed, down, but kind of a little relieved. And what's that about? Is it one of those, therefore, but the grace of God go I kind of things? Sure glad I didn't kill my father and marry my mother. Right? One of those kind of feelings? Is it the feeling that tragedy or catastrophes happen to the great, so what happens to me is not nearly so bad? Right? My daughters didn't betray me. Right? They didn't take away everything I had after I gave them so much. I sent the good daughter away. It's interesting to me, this focus on the audience in Aristotle's definition. Typically, the protagonist, or the tragic hero, as a person is sometimes called, has what's called hamartia, an error in judgment, a tragic flaw. In Lear, of course, we have the love test. There's a certain vanity in King Lear, right? He wants to be pleased. He wants people to tell him how much he is loved and adored. And the daughter who truly loves him refuses to participate in this charade. And instead of learning from this, listening to his heart, Lear focuses on his bruised ego. And the rest, as they say, is history. Well, not really history. But there you go. Right? Hamartia. This error in judgment, this step in the wrong direction. Sometimes it's a result of pride, hubris. Right? Thinking of Oedipus as an obvious example. Lear is another good example. Not always, though. When I think about Lear, and I know I'm talking about Lear a lot, that is our last play. He is our last tragic hero. There's a line in King Lear where he says, I'm a man more sinned against than sinning. And when I teach this, and those of you who took my 215 will testify, I always stop at that line and I say, is he really? It's a good question. Is he a man more sinned against than sinning or not? because his sins are many. But often in tragedy, what befalls the sinner does exceed the sin. I was thinking of Othello, who brings it on to himself. I mean, with big helpings from Iago, of course. But the final dagger is yielded by Othello. Well, actually, not technically a dagger. Strangles her. Doesn't work the metaphor so nicely, though. When Shakespeare was writing his tragedies, right, he was influenced by those around him, including Marlowe and Kidd. And the mature tragedies, and I'm thinking of Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, and Lear in particular, right? Early 1600s. These are the great ones. There's a lot that is owed to what has come before them, right? In terms of dramatic presentation. The presence of ghosts, right? For example, magic or witches, a lot of violence and carnage. And by the way, on the Shakespearean stage, they did try to recreate that carnage with well-placed sacks that would have some sort of animal blood in them, placed around the body of the victim. Hopefully they had good swordsmen who were accurate in their thrusts, or it could have been a little bit worse. But this revenge, right? One of the things, like Hamlet, of course, prominent, is a revenge tragedy. Somebody's done something, and I'm going to take my revenge. Right? Of course, in Hamlet's case, his father is dead, presumably murdered according to the ghost, if you believe what the ghost says. And he must avenge his father. Othello, a different sort of revenge. My wife has fooled around on me, so I must kill her. Macbeth is the one storyline which is really different. I actually was toying with teaching Macbeth. I mean, when I first got to class, as I said, Hamlet and Lear jumped out as two obvious choices for tragedies, but Macbeth was pulling on me pretty good. But there was only so much we could do. But Macbeth is unusual in that the villain is center stage, kind of a different sort of protagonist, if you will, right? But that kind of turns and twists things around a little bit, right? The thing with the tragedies, and all of them have a lot in common, of course, because they are tragic, but we do see some relief. We do see some scenes where there's some comic relief. In Lear, King Lear, for example, we have the Fool. Right? It's kind of a little bit of a way of, how shall we put it, easing the tension. We see this in modern day horror films all the time, where in the horror film there's, always some kind of thing that'll happen that'll get a laugh. Probably right afterwards, somebody's throat will be slashed. But that's how that goes. Right? So it breaks away a little bit from Aristotle's concept of the unities, right? The tragedy should only deal with tragedy, and comedy should only deal with comedy. Those of you who took my 215 class may also be familiar with Christopher Marlowe's Faustus. Remember that? Every other scene went back and forth between scenes with Faustus and the very serious issues of selling his soul to the devil. But every other scene was a laugh. Deliberately low end, if you will, humor. And there are reasons for it, but we're not talking about Marlowe today, are we? So as I look back on the list of tragedies that Shakespeare wrote, some of these are the Some of the greatest plays ever. As I said, Hamlet, King Lear, Macbeth, Othello, Romeo and Juliet would be classified here with this group, Antony and Cleopatra, Julius Caesar. There's some of the other ones which, probably not quite as fun. Titus, Andronicus, Coriolanus, Timon of Athens. Can't always hit a home run. But the tragedy, I wanted us to really think about this notion. I'm going to go back to Aristotle, how I began talking about this. This issue of pity and fear in catharsis. We watch the great fall. Kings, princes. We watch them fall. What happens with us?